and let's see how that goes. So Safaa, would you like to welcome the group?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this CIES 2020 panel on equity targeting, raising learning profiles for those at the bottom of the pyramid. I am Safaa El-Kogali. I'm a practice manager at the World Bank. And Luis Crouch is co-chairing this session with me. So I'll pass it on to Luis and then I'll come back.
Okay, thanks, Safaa. I'm Luis Crouch from RTI and have been working on measuring inequality issues, both under the RISE program of DFID, but also working quite a bit with Dan Wagner over the past few years. And maybe I'll just kind of motivate at least what interested me in this area, and in particular in some of the topics that will be discussed here and that I was just discussing at a panel with chaired by Dan Wagner. And that is that I was invited by Room to Read to give a kind of technical plenary at one of their Asia regional conference. And I just by luck, in their impact evaluations, they presented not just the effect size, which normally people do, and they show the means and then they show the standard deviations, the standard errors, but nobody ever shows the standard deviations in a lot of these things. And in one of their particular projects, they showed it, and I saw that in the after case, after the intervention, the standard deviation had increased, and I said, well, that's not great. But then I noticed that the improvement in the mean was so much greater than the increase in the standard deviation that, at least by one measure of inequality, namely the coefficient of variation, the intervention had not only improved kids' reading abilities on average, but also had vastly reduced the inequality of the reading ability. And so I became curious and started thinking about whether this applies in, let's say RTI's own projects or other people's projects. And then, right around the time that I was getting all excited about this, Salman approached me and pointed out some work that they were doing, and we all said, well, this is quite interesting stuff. We need to get beyond reporting on whether these projects are successful in improving the averages, but also looking at what's happening in terms of reducing inequality. Obviously, the SDGs call for reductions in inequality, and so on. So, yeah, that's kind of the motivation. I apologize that I actually have to go back to Dan Wagner's panel, but I'll be back here after about 10 or 15 minutes. But I'm going to have to leave, and Safaa will take over from now on as being the chair, and then I'll come back quietly later on. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Luis. So, I mean, I'm really delighted that we have 4 speakers today, and the topic of equity and learning outcomes is very important and a priority for us at the World Bank. As some of you may know, we're really looking as to the causes and to measuring the extent of learning poverty around the world. I cover part of the Africa region, mostly the eastern and the southern, but really our latest numbers show that more than half of 10-year-old children in developing countries are unable to read and comprehend a basic age-appropriate text. So this is very serious when we speak about the SDGs and having equality and learning outcomes. I think if more than half of 10-year-olds are unable to read or comprehend the basic text, we have a serious problem. In Africa, our numbers are showing that it's over 80%. So this is kids who are not enrolled, but also those who have been enrolled for a number of years. And so measurement becomes very, very important to basically find out who is not learning, but also why they're not learning. And this session touches on that. We'll start off with Lauren is going to set us off on the options for reaching the most vulnerable children through the connections and disconnections between policies and practices. And then we have Salman, Ravinder, and Maitri speak about different measurement issues and how we can use survey data to get at some of these issues on equity and learning outcomes. So with that, should we go ahead and start with Lauren?
Great. Thank you, Safaa, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Pisani with Save the Children. I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and Amy Jo Dowd, who's now with the LEGO Foundation. I don't think Amy Jo is online quite yet, but she will be momentarily, so hopefully she can participate in our discussion a little bit later.
Here you go, girl.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. It's hard to see everybody in these like big Zoom meetings. So that's even better. But anyway, what we're presenting on today and the charge that we got from the Learning at the Bottom of the Pyramid group and Dan Wagner was to think about diversity and equity in education, specifically the connections and disconnections that we're seeing globally between policy and practice. That's obviously quite a broad charge. So we did a broad landscape analysis, including things from pre-primary up through secondary education. And that doesn't lend itself particularly well to a 12-minute PowerPoint presentation. So I'm gonna do my best to just kind of lay the foundation for some of these bigger topics and especially some of the solutions that we're finding in the literature. And then the other panelists are gonna dig more into some of the specifics, I think, of some of these issues around measurement and learning. So I'll keep going, Amber, if that's okay. And let's just go to the next slide also. I can say that there are 4 main factors that we're finding are really driving the gaps in schooling and learning for children today. And those are poverty, disability, gender, and language of instruction. The way that we structured our analysis here was to do sort of a broad landscape analysis and then to do kind of a case study where we can really highlight some of these connections and disconnections between policy and practice. So you'll see me going back and forth from the global literature to case studies as I'm presenting this information. But it's along these 4 topics that I'll be speaking today. And some of the main findings that we were finding are that children today at the bottom of the pyramid tend to be those living with multiple dimensions of disadvantage, or to put it differently, children who have more diverse profiles when they're entering schools. So perhaps girls who are poor, or a child with a learning disability who is also learning in a language that's not their mother tongue. These tend to be the children today who really are struggling the most to both access and have successful learning in formalized education systems. We're also seeing that the inequities in access and learning tend to compound over time. So children come to systems with these diverse profiles, and there's really a variability of systems, especially in low and middle income countries, to absorb those children and their different experiences, such that as they progress in grades, either their advantages or their disadvantages tend to compound, and they're either successfully kind of completing and learning their education, or they're falling behind and eventually dropping out or not achieving the learning outcomes. As Safaa was mentioning, a lot of children are now, or more children are now making it through education, but they might not be successfully learning as they're going through. And the solutions that we were finding in the literature are really kind of in 3 buckets, or on 3 levels. One is at the policy level, of course. One is within schools and teaching communities, and the other is within communities and families. So I'll keep going. I'm starting with poverty because that really is the leading factor driving educational disadvantage around the globe today. And the relationship between poverty and learning is so strong that you really see it from the most macro level down to the very micro community levels. So in general, we see that low income countries have weaker learning outcomes than middle or higher income countries. Within countries, it's poor children who really are showing the weakest learning outcomes. If you have any of these other diversity or disadvantage factors and you're also poor, for example, poor girls, tend to be the least likely to be accessing education in the world. So in terms of a geographic concentration, a lot of this is sub-Saharan Africa is highlighted as an area where learning outcomes really are weakest and most sensitive to community levels of poverty. We'll keep going. The case study that we chose for poverty was Ethiopia. And one of the reasons that we chose Ethiopia is because they actually have made a lot of progress in recent years, but it's a great example of the inadequacy of averages. So on average, we're seeing advancements in education and other childhood issues within Africa. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that the gaps between wealthy and poor are very substantial and they are very consistent over time. So despite these gains that we might be seeing, we've really done very little to close the gaps for wealthy and poor children. And to focus more on the solutions, something interesting was that home and community support to supplement school-based learning is something that we found evidence for across all levels of education. I think often we think of family support for learning as something more applicable to younger children, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that even youth and older children who are doing more livelihoods and kind of continued education type programs, if the more family support they have for those initiatives, the more successful they can be. So I think that's was good evidence to suggest that family and community support throughout a child's life cycle is really important. In addition, there are a number of innovative pro-poor targeting initiatives. Actually, Salman and some of his co-authors have a great paper from Malawi about using administrative data to more purposefully target teachers into high-need communities. So there are a number of examples of things like that where we can really start targeting the most disadvantaged children and therefore help improve learning for everybody. I'll keep moving on to gender. Gender is one of those issues that has received a ton of global attention over the last few decades, but disadvantages for girls really still persist. We're seeing improvements in gender parity in enrollment throughout different levels of education, but where the disparities become much more apparent is with completion and actually with learning. A lot of the mechanisms through which children or girls have lower learning outcomes tend to be around gender-based issues, issues of gender-based violence, early marriage, absence from school due to things like menstruation, if the schools don't have the appropriate facilities for girls to have their own restrooms and things like that. And in terms of concentrating the bottom of the pyramid in terms of gender issues, this really tends to be in places where the societal norms perpetuate these gender disparities or devalue education for girls. There's a lot of communities where there's been a lot of progress for girls in education, but in areas where the societal norms are kind of perpetuating these gender disparities, the gaps that you're seeing for girls are persistent and in some cases even getting larger. One of those contexts is Afghanistan. We chose to dig into Afghanistan because there have been huge investments in improving education for all children, but especially for girls, both from the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan and from international donors since the fall of the Taliban. But there's been a real disconnect between that investment and what's happening on the ground. It's a difficult place for authorities to reinforce or to enforce policies. And so the decision making is often left at the school and at the community level. And there are a lot of deeply held community beliefs that are preventing girls from accessing school. Some of the school level factors that you would find in Afghanistan, but are also echoed in other communities, are the distance to school. and the lack of female teachers or appropriate infrastructure for females and girls to be going to school. Parents or families tend to be more conservative about their children traveling to school if they're in a dangerous context or if they feel like it might not be safe. So actually some of the solutions that have the biggest effect sizes and show the strongest results for girls are around infrastructure and improving that, building more schools and improving the infrastructure for women and girls in the school. There is some literature to suggest that as a short to medium term solution, provision of more home or community-based education using female teachers can be effective. It's obviously not an ideal long-term solution because these teachers tend to have less training and they're not as linked with the Ministry of Education curriculum and things like that. But in a place where there are a lot of security concerns that kind of are rolling through, it could be a solution for continuity of education for girls if maybe they can't always be sent to school like their male counterparts can. And some of the global evidence suggests that actually overall improvements to pedagogical practices are some of the most effective ways to improve learning for all children, but especially for girls. David Evans did a great analysis last year, a meta-analysis of some interventions that were targeted more general and some that were more targeted at girls. And some of the more general interventions that were just improving pedagogy in classrooms really were the most effective overall. So I think there's something to think about in terms of just improving quality writ large for all kids. Disability is an area where we really see widespread challenges persisting in access and in learning. And the gaps you see here are as big or potentially bigger than the ones we were looking at earlier with poverty. The quality issues that you find that detract from a typically developing child's learning are that much more troublesome for kids with different kinds of learning or physical disabilities, and those need to be considered alongside conversations around any kind of disability specific issues like assistive technologies or things like that. We found evidence that teachers are not always in favor of inclusive education, and a lot of it relates to their experience working with such students and their level of training. A lot of teachers reported feeling anxiety about their ability to include children with diverse types of learning needs into their classrooms because they're already overwhelmed with the responsibilities that they have. And one interesting example of how this all is playing out is in India. So India has a lot of supportive, inclusive education policies for their formal education system all the way throughout, but there's a big disconnect between how parents and families are accessing those services. The literature we reviewed suggested that there was a lot of confusion in terms of how to access any kind of learning aids or support for getting these resources, and I think that's something common. So some of the solutions that we were looking at or that we found were some related to screening, early identification, and potentially treatment for children with disabilities can really support them. I mean, the brain science suggests that intervening as early as possible can really potentially help these children be able to mainstream more so later in life. There's also a lot of social and behavior change literature related to the attitudinal barriers that might come from communities or schools. And then on the policy level, focusing on investment, equal investment for kids with disabilities. You could see across the different states in India, huge variations in how much the states were investing in education for children with disabilities. And so there could be more done to mandate a certain level potentially of investment that went to these resources. Amber is prodding me forward, so I'm trying really hard to go quickly. But lastly, we have language of instruction. And this is another area where there often are national education policies that uphold a child's right to learn in a particular language, but actually it's teachers in an individual classroom day to day that are making the decision about what language they're teaching in and how often. Teachers often voiced concerns that they weren't well equipped to teach in mother tongue. Maybe they didn't have the appropriate materials or training. In some cases, teachers have multiple mother tongues in their language, or in their classrooms, so it's difficult to make a decision about that. And that's kind of at the lower grades. And then at the upper levels, we're seeing that a lot of teachers actually lack the sufficient training and competence in the international language they're trying to teach. That's related to kind of teaching literacy in general in an international language, but then gets even more compounded when teachers are trying to teach subject matters like math or science or things that have highly technical vocabularies. And a location where you can see a lot of these tensions play out is in Kenya. They have a lot of progressive language policy where children should be learning in mother tongue from pre-primary through grade 4, and then switching to English in grade 4. But there's a lot of literature suggesting that teachers feel they're not adequately trained to be using mother tongue in the early grades, and they don't have the relevant materials to do so. And then at the upper grades, there's also subject matter, lack of subject matter knowledge, so that there's often ineffective teaching at these upper levels. Some of the solutions were related to engagement of families and more production of local materials for the younger learners. In older age groups, more targeted assessment and in-service support for upper grade teachers could help them progress in their practice. And different ways of thinking about teacher allocation or enforcement of these mother tongue education policies is something to think about at the policy level. In conclusion, what we're seeing is that policies tend to be pushing forward inclusion of all children into education systems, but the systems themselves haven't recognized or haven't fully realized how to serve the diverse student body that they have. So we need to progress beyond this one-size-fits-all idea and really start thinking about differentiated strategies to meet the needs of a diverse group of students. Some of that can be done at the parent and community level to ease some of these disconnections. Some of it, of course, is equipping teachers to serve the diverse children in their classrooms. And then some of it could be innovative uses of technology, of administrative data, of different types of creative solutions and investment that need to be leveraged that haven't so far. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren.
Go ahead, Amber.
That was about 15 minutes, so hopefully that's okay if we stick to that for everyone. I'm going to pull up the next presentation. Go ahead, Safaa.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Lauren. I think this is great, and it sets the stage. The next speaker is Salman, and he'll talk about how actually targeting that you spoke about will be important in the context of Malawi. The different students with different learning outcomes. So over to you, Salman.
Thank you, Safaa. Amber, I cannot see the slides.
I'm getting there, just a second. Okay. It's that one. Go ahead and start talking though.
Thank you, Safaa. Thank you for the panelists for coming together in such testing time for this presentation. So this is ongoing work in Malawi. It's about like 4 years of work on like getting into the plumbing of the Malawi public education system and trying to figure out how to measure inequalities effectively. This is work funded by the Royal Norwegian Embassy and the Department for International Development. Thanks for the research grants and collaboration with the University of Oxford. So this is first nationally independent, nationally representative independent longitudinal survey. So those of you who are familiar with this line of research, the first one was in Pakistan, the LEAPS project, and the second one was in Andhra Pradesh, by Karthik, which basically looks at tracking schools and children over periods of time. So we are trying to do that in the context of a developing country like Malawi and doing it at a national scale for the first time in order to map out the learning profiles and the trajectory of learning. So looking at like what determines learning outcomes at various levels, schools, teachers, and students. So the key point that I want to stress here is that prior to 2015-16, when this work started, Malawi has a history of stagnating or education outcomes that are going down. So we are kind of like blindly shooting for policy reforms in the context of like such education systems. So having like grounded data, granular level data, what it can tell us, and building on what Lauren mentioned in her presentation in terms of like the key dimensions of like disadvantages and how they compound over time. Again, I will focus on like giving a preview of this work because there's a lot of information to digest. So this is an archival kind of like deck. And Amber, I'll let you know where to kind of like move the slides, which one to skip in order to remain within the 15 minutes. Next one. So we have administered a learning test to about 20,000 kids at standard 4 levels, spread over a population of about 800 schools nationally. So it's a norm reference test, and we apply item response theory in order to come up with like a scaled score. So the key point to note is like 500 is the mean score and 150 is the standard deviation. So going back to the point that that Louis pointed out in the introduction, that there's a lot of variability in the data, and we are not measuring that variability effectively. So we have come to a realization that the education systems are not performing well, or there is shockingly poor performance in the learning test. But we are not, but the policy response is agnostic to where the variability in the system is. And largely the comparisons in the literature have been between developing countries and OECD countries, that how that convergence will take place. So this data allows us to look at it from a very different perspective, that how much it will take to bring like Malawian public primary schools to the same level of performance, that what is the gap between the schools and within the schools. Next one. So what I'm presenting today is the findings from the baseline survey. So I said that this is longitudinal in nature, but the results are purely based on the first round of survey, which was done before a large-scale World Bank operation funded by Global Partnership of Education was rolled out in 2016. So it also allows to serve as a seed bed for a number of pilot interventions that the government is implementing. So the idea here is to measure and identify constraints to learning, and then support the government to iteratively adapt the design of the interventions and rigorously test them using experimental design. So this large body of work, we expect like the first set of results are being presented today, and then it will build up in the coming years. Next. So no surprises here. The learning outcomes are shockingly poor. So Safaa mentioned about the focus on the learning poverty, and you can see like kids sitting in standard 4, only 68% of them can do a simple mathematical operation like 7 minus 4. So you have about 32% kids in the same classroom that haven't mastered the basic standard 1 competency. It's even worse when we look at like English, that basic proficiency over the alphabets. You have 62% of the students who are not performing well on just identifying simple alphabets. Next. So what is this data telling us, and why is it important to have this kind of like granular data on different levels of the education system? So the simple averages mask huge inequities between and within schools. So learning outcomes are strongly associated with number of disadvantages faced by a school. And these are not traditional disadvantages. So this can vary from one context to another context, and this can be highly microgeographic factors that can lead to the compounding of disadvantages, which result in very different learning profiles and trajectories for students who are virtually in next door communities. So if there are two schools located like 2 kilometers from one another, you can see very different learning profiles and trajectories of those schools depending on where the disadvantages are concentrated. Disadvantages are a consequence of an unintended policy response, which basically sees all public schools as equivalent, as homogeneous. So standardizing those schools and saying that all schools are going to get the same amount of resources from the government is kind of like the reason why you see different trajectories and different profiles. And this kind of like this compounding goes on at multiple levels, and we are going to unravel it at school, at teachers, and the classroom level. And we will also show that what happens within the classroom, that how the kids are kind of like how a lesson is structured with a very different audience and at what competency to drive kind of like the lesson plans in a particular school. Next. So I'm going to take a pause here in terms of like, this is like the large, a snapshot of like all the key findings of this analytical work, that these are two schools which are located in a sub-district in Malawi. So that's like a distance of like about 5 kilometers apart from each other. And these two schools are performing, one school is performing at 544 learning score, which means that it's about 0.3 standard deviations above the mean. And the other school is 0.2 standard deviation below it. So the distance between these two schools in terms of learning outcomes is on average a kid in standard 4 in Chimambara school is performing 2 years of lost learning. So on average, a fourth year kid is at grade 2 level of competency compared to the school which is in the next community. And what is driving this disadvantage? Both are rural schools. Both are located within the same spatial boundaries. What is driving the differences is accumulation of the disadvantages over time. That the student population came from more disadvantaged backgrounds with a number of disadvantages which we capture as psychological poverty. And the disadvantages are driven from a hierarchical linear model in which we map out what matters in terms of like driving the differences in learning scores. So what we see is that the class size in standard 1 is 140 for one of the school, and for the other school, it's under 90. And the people-teacher ratio, which is like the driving factor here, is about like 100 to 1 in one school and almost half in the other school. So what is going on? Why the resources are distributed so inequitably and resulting in different outcomes here? So that is the result of like not having granular information in terms of like targeting of the resources where the resources are needed the most. So the teachers keep accumulating in areas which are closest to the urban centers. So in a traditional public policy sense, if we were to go and support the government and provide technical support to reform the system, the narrow scope of reference points that we will look at will include like rural or urban, or look at like some measurable indicators of disadvantages. But most of the time, the problem lies that we are not even measuring the right thing. So within the rural schools themselves, there could be a lot of difference depending on what constitutes a disadvantage. And that is not easy to tell unless and until we have very detailed data of what's happening inside the education system. So even the survey that we have rolled out in 800 schools is not representative at the sub-district level, but it still allows us to capture some of these variations at the local level, and we can see like huge differences coming in. Next. Next. So these factors are driven, as I've already mentioned, the technical details I'm going to skip here, but these are kind of like grounded in a hierarchical linear regression model where like the students are nested within the schools and the schools nested within the sub-district. And we do like analysis at the school, at the teacher and the student level to identify different factors that are driving outcomes. And you can see that the distance to the nearest trading center, which was not on the policy maker's agenda, explains about like 0.15 standard deviations in the learning outcome. So it captures some of the unobservables, but even after controlling for those the remoteness factors, there are other things that the government can pay attention to in terms of improving the student learning materials, how much notebooks the students have, and how the textbook student to textbook ratio, and whether the children have pens and pencils. So those are the things that are driving the test scores. There's a lot of emphasis on construction of new classrooms, but there is little emphasis on providing resources to improve the infrastructure. So I'm going to skip the slides on, so you can go on your own time. If you can skip to slide number 16. Next.
Don't see a number, so tell me when to stop. Is that the right one, Salman, or should I keep going?
Sorry, just a second. I lost my slide connection.
And you have about 2 minutes left according to my timer.
Okay, so let's move to 21, slide number 21.
Okay. Sorry, Salman, there aren't slide numbers on the slides, and I'm in screen share mode, so I'm not sure what slide it will be. So tell me when to stop,
Okay.
or tell me a number, tell me a title of a slide, please.
Let's go to the school level disadvantages.
Looking for school level. Impact of student characteristics school level?
No, school level disadvantages, 3 more slides.
Thank you. Perfect.
Yes. So after doing all this analysis at the different levels, so you can go to the slides in between, which basically break it down at the school, at the teacher and the student level, that what matters. What we come up with are the key drivers that are explaining this differential performance in the learning outcomes. And what we find is that the key driver, the school, is more than 10 kilometers from the nearest trading center. But even after controlling for that, there are certain factors that matter at every level, whether the school is providing enough materials to the kids, whether the school is paying salaries in time. So most of the times we go in and we design policies which improve incentives to for the teachers. But at the overall system level, if there is no fiscal space to pay out the basic salaries of the teachers, it's going to create kind of like lower learning outcomes. Student absence rate, we know from the literature, is kind of like very critical. And again, in terms of the government response to these disadvantages, that the teachers do not end up in these remoter schools, and the teachers that end up going to those schools are generally low-trained teachers or inexperienced, as captured by the PD4 students. And the student populations that are coming into the schools are largely ones that are most disadvantageous in terms of like not having literate parents, or they are from they are psychologically poor in the sense of like measuring their mindsets and behaviors. That the schools have a larger population of students with fixed mindsets. And and they don't feel a sense of belonging to be there in school. So simple behavioral interventions can be like low-hanging fruits in terms of improving the outcomes. Next.
And we're at time, Salman. So is this your last slide?
Sure. So
Thank you.
in terms of the compounding of these disadvantages, so you can see that what does it cost? Like we started with the example of 2 schools, which highly divergent outcomes. So if you plot this in terms of the number of disadvantages, so you see about 100 points difference between the schools with 0 disadvantages compared to the schools with 3+ disadvantages, which means that 43% of the public primary schools in Malawi are at 2 years lower level of learning compared to 11% of the schools which have 0 disadvantages. So it's possible within the system to improve the outcomes if the policy is not agnostic in terms of treating the school homogeneously. Thank you.
Thank you. While I get the next slide up, Safaa, I had assumed that we were taking questions at the end, correct?
Yes, I thought it's better we go through all the slides. I mean, because I think the topics more or less are around similar, so it's better to have all the questions at the end. So thanks very much, Salman.
Okay, and then remind me, is Tanzania next or the other one?
It's Maitri on the inequality in learning outcomes.
Great, thank you.
And
all right, and thanks everyone for your patience as we work to get this going under adverse circumstances, for sure.
But I think it's going super well so far. So
oh, don't jinx me now.
No, I won't jinx you. I'm just giving you a word of encouragement.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, so thanks a lot again, Salman, for kind of zooming into Malawi. And now we'll move to some of the measurement issues, and Maitri will present on those.
Yes, thank you, Safaa, and thank you, Amber, for navigating the PowerPoint. So my name is Maitri Punjabi, and I actually have a co-presenter, Jennifer Ryan, who's on the call as well. We're both with RTI International, and today we will be presenting on how we can measure some of these inequities that exist, because that is something that is fairly new, and I think all the panelists have addressed that it's quite important for us to do and consider. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about how we define inequity for these measurement purposes and how we are proposing we can measure inequity at a baseline and how we can measure inequity over time. Next slide.
So many of you may be familiar with this photo and have seen it floating around the internet. I like to use it as an interesting visual to explain the ideas behind equality and equity, where on the left you see an equality of inputs. Everybody's getting the same leg up, but you still see someone getting left behind. They're not able to see the baseball game. On the right, you see equity, an unequal distribution of inputs, but an equal outcome. So in our presentation, we're going to use equality and equity interchangeably, because what we're really talking about a lot is equity of outcomes. We're able to, in early grade reading programs, measure reading ability through oral reading fluency and different measures like that. And so when we're talking about equity measures, we're talking about it through that lens. Our argument in this presentation is really that measuring equality in a program through just a shift in mean scores doesn't really do justice, and it's not a good indicator of success of an early grade reading program. So we need to see all students learning and reading, and that means some students need to gain more than others, so that outcomes are more equal, and we're not just seeing high averages. So we can focus our efforts on this goal by using equity measures to help gauge success and make program evaluation more multidimensional. Next slide. So this slide's a nice quick visual to show why just averages aren't always great. So these 4 data sets, this is known as Anscombe's quartet to a lot of you statisticians out there. When these data sets are visualized, we can clearly see that they're all very different. When it's on a chart, they all have the same summary statistics. They've all got the same mean X, mean Y. They've all got the same variance and correlations, but they're all telling a very different story. So this is a common example in statistics to show the importance of data visualization. And so we want to use the same example to encourage you to look at your data through different lenses to get a better understanding of the story. Next slide.
And there are several measures in the field of economics that look at this issue, focused on income and wealth distribution. So first we have the Gini coefficient. This is defined as the comparison of cumulative proportions of the population against the cumulative proportions of wealth. So when people say that the top 1% of the population owns 80% of the country's wealth, they are speaking to this metric. The range of this metric is from 0 to 1, where 0 indicates equal distribution of wealth and 1 indicates a scenario where one individual holds all of the wealth. A second metric is the Thale index. So the Thale index essentially measures the distance that the population is away from true equality. The range here is from 0 to theoretically infinity. Then we have the Hoover index, which is known as the Robin Hood index because it's defined as the portion of the total community wealth that would have to be redistributed in order to achieve equal distribution. So prior literature and within our field suggests using the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient has been used a few times or several times in years past. So we move forward with our research on focusing on this metric. And to help you visualize what this really means is this image on the left. So the Gini coefficient is essentially your area of A, the area of A, over the area of A plus B. So this curve that's in the middle, sorry, if we can go back a slide. The curve that's in the middle, the Lorenz curve, is plotting your population over your the wealth for that share. So the closer that the curve is to the line of equality indicates higher equality within that population. So a large value of A over A plus B indicates quite a high amount of inequality in our population. So this is just to help you visualize what we're talking about when we speak about the Gini coefficient. So we also choose to focus on the Gini coefficient because this measure is a little bit easier to translate to a broader audience. So since we are adapting this from a traditional economic definition into how we're going to adapt it for speaking about learning gains, the Gini coefficient is best suited to adapt it for this context and be able to translate it in a way that we can understand and learn from and measure over time. Next slide. So this graph is kind of like a textbook example of what we might see in our early grade reading programs. So we have graph A, which is the blue line here. Traditionally, we might see such a graph, such a distribution at the baseline of an early grade reading program. So we have a large percent of non-readers or a huge tail on the right-hand side, and we have a low average. So the Gini coefficient in this case might be closer to 1 than it would be to 0 because of such of a spread in learning outcomes. And then as time goes on, we see perhaps a shift towards the red line, which is labeled with a B. And this might be at the midline or endline point of the early grade reading program. So we have a reduction in the percentage of non-readers in our population, but we don't see a dramatic shift in the mean score. So in this scenario, the Gini coefficient would go down because we are moving away from having as many 0 scores. And then lastly, the distribution that's labeled with a C or the green line is closer to what we might want to see in our population. And this means a complete drop in 0 scores, a dramatic shift in the mean, and a distribution that is moving towards a normal distribution. So we address that natural populations are closer fitted to normal distributions. So, even though in theory we may want all kids reading at very high levels, the actual natural spread of it will be closer to a natural distribution. So with this said, we know that there's a limitation on the Gini coefficient, that we can't have complete equity or equality in that sense, because the Gini may never equal 0, because all kids will not be reading at 50 correct words per minute at the exact same time. So with this in mind, we move forward using the Gini coefficient, just keeping this limitation in mind. Next slide.
So we've done quick desk studies of a few early grade reading programs to give you an example of how the Gini coefficient can sort of fit into the program evaluation toolbox. For program 1, here's a program in South Asia. We're looking at baseline to midline gains for grade 2 students between control and a treatment group. You can see from baseline to midline, the oral reading fluency scores went up slightly for treatment schools and went down for control. Our standard deviation went down for control and up for treatment. We had a increase in 0 scores for control and a decrease for treatment, and an okay effect size of 0.24. This doesn't help tell a really great story, as a lot of people have trouble visualizing the shift between an oral reading fluency average of 7 to 10.8. It doesn't really tell you a very great story. So I personally like to show distribution shifts to try and give that story a little bit more meaning. So on the right, you can see at the top, we have baseline control versus treatment distributions. And then on the bottom, we have midline control and treatment distributions. You can see between baseline and midline, the treatment distribution shown in yellow actually moves slightly away from 0 scores and slightly to the right, meaning that children are starting to learn and starting to move into literacy that way. And we can see that on the Gini coefficient. It actually goes up slightly for the control group between baseline and midline, meaning reading is slightly less, or reading achievement is slightly less equal between baseline and midline for control students. And it goes down slightly for treatment, meaning it gets slightly more equal. So the next slide. So this is our second program in East Africa. There's kind of a lot going on here. You can see oral reading fluency went up for both control and treatment across the board. Standard deviation stayed about the same for control and went up for treatment. We've got a reduction in 0 scores across the board. Our effect sizes for both control and treatment between baseline and endline are really high. And these are grade 2 students again. And you can also see a reduction in Gini coefficient across both control and treatment between baseline and endline. And so we also see between the top and the bottom distributions, they're starting to shift away from having a high proportion of non-readers into a more normal distribution that we would want to see of real readers, of children gaining literacy. So we think here the Gini coefficient is really helpful to give an extra little boost for further investigation. We would want to know what's happening independent of our reading program intervention that's creating a more equitable learning environment all around.
And then lastly, we have this third program, which is in West Africa. And here, so again, we have from baseline to midline, looking at grade 2 again, a control and treatment population. So if we look at the mean scores to start with, we don't see anything meaningful. The previous example that Jennifer was talking about, again, just an increase in the ORF score for 3 words per minute. It doesn't really tell us much. So just looking at that isn't too helpful. So if we look at standard deviation or the coefficient of variation, hoping to see maybe something, we do see that there is a change in the standard deviation from the treatment at baseline to the treatment at midline, but that again also will not tell us if the program is successful or what's really going on with the students in the population. So Then if we look at zero scores, we do see some positive outcomes here. We see that the zero scores have reduced for both control and treatment. The treatment group saw a larger reduction in zero scores of 18%, whereas control saw a reduction of 12%. And this results in an effect size that is of a moderate size, so 0.21. So with all of that information, we can kind of say that, okay, the picture is a little hazy, but there does seem to be some improvements going on. The zero scores are going down, which is good. The variability is also changing. So if we want to take a deeper dive into this, which we do, we look at the distributions on the right here. This kind of helps fill in that picture and show us that, yes, the distribution is in fact changing. We can see that for the treatment group, which is labeled here as cohort 1, it's highlighted in a slight yellow. We can see that the distribution is shifting slightly to the right, showing a positive shift. So you can see the drop in zero scores and the slight increase in the mean, but you can truly see the shift in the distribution with these images. So the Gini coefficient is a way for us to quantify this shift in another one value kind of way. And we're able to capture that shift for the treatment group here. As you can see, the Gini coefficient for the treatment group goes down by roughly 0.11, and the control group stays about the same. So this example is kind of painting a picture where, looking at the typical, the usual suspects of what we usually see for evaluations within our reports, it may not be as clear, but providing and adding in this Gini coefficient might help you understand the data a little bit better as a whole, rather than giving you an average or an average spread or just a drop in zero scores. So the takeaway here is that the story can be complex for evaluating these programs, but adding in a Gini coefficient to this table can help you really grasp what's happening in the population. Next slide. So just to wrap up here, so the key takeaways again is that just relying on mean scores or the effect sizes, Salman, you were talking about this earlier, that using just those basic metrics really just can't be enough. Sometimes we see that there's no story being told, and that's when we realize that we need more. We need more to be able to tell the story of what's happening in the population. And so here we're proposing to add in the Gini coefficient to help paint a fuller picture. We do want to note that the Gini coefficient shouldn't be used as a standalone measure in this context. It is a fairly new measure in this context, so we don't mean for it to replace the usual metrics that we use for reporting, but simply as a complementary metric that we think can really help inform programs and inform the governments and groups that we work with.
And so we do have a few limitations. While the Gini coefficient can be used to measure equity within an early grade reading program, it's not going to be able to tell us why or why not. And that's kind of where we would rely back on the work of Lauren and Salman about digging into where these inequities lie and what's going on the ground. Also, since learning is never going to be uniform within a population, and we're not going to get all kids reading at exactly 65 words per minute all together at once, the Gini coefficient's never going to equal 0, so that shouldn't be our aim. And then since the Gini coefficient is not currently used in international education, we don't really have much guidance on what constitutes equitable learning in terms of Gini coefficient values. So we would suggest using it more as a relative measure between baseline and follow-up points to measure change in equity rather than at a single time point. So that is our presentation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for being right on time. I'll pull up the next one.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think it's the way these presentations are organized are actually great, because we kind of talk in general about some of the issues, and then we kind of zoom into a specific country and the analysis done there. So last but not least, we're going to look into the short-term gains in learning scores and what matters. And the case of Tanzania, which Ravinder is going to present.
Thanks so much, Safaa, and thank you, Amber, for keeping this ship afloat. And thanks to everyone who's joined. It's a little intimidating coming after such a technically sophisticated presentation, but in honor of what Maitri and Jennifer were saying about the need to sort of get into some of the whys and wherefores a little bit, we thought it'd be useful to take another case study following Malawi, looking at its neighbor Tanzania. And it's great that we've got Lewis Crouch co-chairing this conversation, because we were all very inspired by Lewis's work on raising the floor and how countries which have made rapid improvements in overall learning outcomes have tended to do it by significantly raising outcomes in the lower half of the distribution. So what we want to do here, or what we have done, is take a look at an example of a country which did achieve, not stratospheric, but solid short-term improvements in learning, and to see what some of the distributional aspects and some of the causal aspects were. And I should mention, I've been getting a pop-up every now and then that says my internet connection is poor. So if at any point it sounds like I'm not coming through clearly in terms of audio, let me know and I'll turn off my video, and that might help. Go ahead, Amber. So the information that we're going to use is drawn from the service delivery indicators. I'm guessing many of you are very familiar with this, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but this has been carried out in a number of countries now by the World Bank. It picks grade 4 students for random testing in maths and English, or the local language of instruction if that's different. It's a mixture. 10 teachers in each school as well. They get a pedagogical assessment. And there's also a follow-up unannounced visit with some classroom observation. And what we're doing in this paper is looking at the SDIs conducted in Tanzania in 2014 and in 2016. Go ahead, Amber. So the 2014 results captured a pretty poor picture. And in actual fact, this survey was conducted at a time when there was widespread discussion within Tanzania about the low level of learning outcomes. It was focused more on the PSLE, the primary school leaving examination, and the CSE, the secondary school leaving examination. But what the SDI revealed is that these problems were occurring further down the chain as early as grade 4. So only 12% of students could multiply triple digits, 22% divide double digits, 25% could read a short paragraph and comprehend it. That's not an exact parallel to the World Bank's learning poverty measure, which Safaa was talking about, because it wasn't restricted explicitly to 10-year-olds, but these are grade 4 students of median age about 11. So it suggests that the level of learning poverty is high. Some of the simpler maths tasks are higher level, but you're still under 50% for most of these fairly basic tasks. Next. 2016, you see a real change. And, obviously things are not problem solved, but you've got a meaningful amount of gain, an additional 7% of students being able to divide double digits, an additional 5% being able to read a paragraph, and an additional 8% being able to multiply single digits, and so on. So this is a pretty significant change in learning outcomes. And as I mentioned, this is mirrored in some of the other tests. So the EGMA showed an improvement in both oral reading and subtraction rates, particularly the oral reading in grade 2, and the PSLE, the main high stakes end of primary examination, had an 11-point increase in pass rate. That was the result that got most of the attention in the country. But you can see that it's happening right across the primary cycle. Question is how and why. Go ahead, Amber. So just to quickly say, if you look at it in terms of overall subject results, you get a similar picture. The biggest increases in English, followed by Kiswahili, and then maths. Next. So the first big takeaway is that the changes in learning reflect, or are at least in some way happening concurrent to, some significant improvements in school standards. So the items advertised in yellow are those where we see an improvement, and the SDI obviously conducts a lot of these kind service, as the name implies, service delivery indicators, so it gives us a very rich basis for analysis. And you see substantial improvements in the share of classrooms with a functioning blackboard, availability of pens, exercise books, and so on. The amount of actual scheduled teaching time that schools are offering, so this is the official sort of timetable the school offers, excluding breaks, and in the real amount of time spent teaching, which is based on the official opening hours plus the time in which teachers, the share of teachers who are found teaching in the classroom, and a sort of a calculation is done to like pull out the overall amount of time that a typical teacher has spent teaching. And you see it's gone from 3 to 4 hours. That's a substantial increase. The share of classrooms where the teacher was found teaching, the share of, we call them orphan classrooms, which is where the students were found on an unannounced visit without a teacher there, that went down. And some improvements as well, not only in teacher effort, but on the actual sort of quality of teacher practices. So an uptick, small uptick in the share of teachers asking questions, providing positive feedback, and so on. On the other hand, you have some negatives on the actual overall sort of input provision level. The number of teachers per school has gone down a little bit, even when the number of teachers, students has gone up. So you have a rise in the PTR or the STR. And there's slight reductions, actually no, pretty substantial reductions in the access to textbooks and also to drinking water. So what you have is a picture of a system which is under some strain, and where the availability of inputs is going down, but nonetheless, the actual effort of teachers made and the actual effectively utilization of the teachers who are available in school is improving. Next. Oh, and I should briefly mention, we don't need to go back, but I should briefly mention that the improvements we're seeing are partly the result of a range of major reform programs going on at the time. You have something called Equip T, supported by DFID, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Something called Lanes, a numeracy program supported by the Global Partnership for Education, and the Education Program for Results, which was a major by the World Bank, and CEDA and DFID, and I'm going to forget someone, and I'm going to get in trouble, but supported by a range of donors is the point. So the SDI presents its data divided by a number of strata, and one of which divides it into rural and urban, but then to sort of finesse things a little more, the urban division is broken down into schools in Dar es Salaam, the capital, and schools in the rest of the country. And the rural division is broken down into most rural districts and a subset of 7 rural districts, regions rather, sorry, which were participating in a program called Equip T, which I mentioned a minute ago. It's a DFID-supported project providing a lot of capacity building, teacher training, some provision of textbooks and so on, teachers' guides. It focused on regions with poor learning outcomes. So you can see both the general distribution pretty clearly here. The less well-off, as a rule, an area was in terms of learning outcomes in 2014, the more rapid the improvement in 2016. So you actually see the Equip T regions, which had the lowest performance, overtaking the rural areas then increasing by almost 10 points, urban by about 6 or 7, and Dar es Salaam, you have a very marginal increase. So just looking at the sort of the least sophisticated level of disaggregation and at the regional level, you can see that there is a catching up story taking place. The overall improvement in learning outcomes is being driven by some raising of the floor. Next. Thank you, Amber. This maintains if you go beyond the regional level to look at the school level. So for example, there's a few patterns to which schools tended to underperform in the 2014, and one very clear one was that smaller schools, the bottom quintile by size, had significantly lower learning outcomes than the larger schools by size, by enrollment. And that gap closes somewhat in the course of 2014 to 16. So you go from about a 15, 16 point gap between the smallest and largest schools to just a 9.6% gap. Similarly, when it comes to infrastructure, you do see a big division in the 2014 data between the schools with more versus more infrastructure. Similar to, sorry, this should have a bit more explanation of this, but similar to the Malawi example that Salman shared earlier, we generate an index of school infrastructure. We take the top and bottom quintiles from that index, and you can see you had a 12-point gap in 2014, and that's reduced to about a 6-point gap by the time you get to 2016. Sorry, I've got some sirens outside. I don't know if you guys can hear that. So, but one thing, it's not, there's no graph for it, but actually what you did find was that the schools with the greater PTRs actually exaggerated, actually picked up learning outcomes slightly more than those with lower PTRs. So that, it matches the story we saw earlier where you had overall PTR worsening, but not actually worsening results. So there's some disconnect in terms of teacher availability and learning, and that presumably, you know, relates to the still relatively low level of teacher utilization. Next. I feel very bossy shouting next like this. Next slide, please, Amber, I should say. Thank you. So that's the school level picture, but most of the variation in learning within Tanzania, much like within most sub-Saharan African countries, is at the student level. This is a simple decomposition we did, and you can see in the sort of second to last row that in 2016, even after there's some sort of equalization, you've got between 50 and 79% of learning variation in maths, English, and Kiswahili happening between students within a single school. We also include the non-verbal reasoning results here. They're a little higher actually in terms of in-school variation at 86, which is quite interesting in itself. Next, Amber. So that was just to point out that really looking at students is where the sort of action is, and this relates nicely to some of what was being said in the first presentation. We definitely see a gender gap in Tanzania, and actually that gender gap doesn't really close. Girls and boys improved to a similar level. You have a slightly bigger rate of increase for girls than boys, but essentially the gender gap remains largely unchanged. However, overage students who were underperforming students below the median age, or below 11, which is roughly the median age, but also above the sort of official age of catchment for standard 4. So these overage students, often repeaters, or in some cases late enrollers, they have tended to perform less well, but that gap did actually close from about 9 points to about 6. So there's some sense of catching up there. However, this goes back to the issue of language of instruction. So the language of instruction in Tanzania is Swahili in primary, but not all students actually speak Kiswahili as their mother tongue, although most of them do sort of speak it, you know, somewhat well. But we do see a gap in learning between those who speak Kiswahili at home as their mother tongue and those who speak a different language. And actually that gap got slightly larger during this time. So even though you have an overall improvement, there is some sense that the needs of students who are not speaking the language of instruction are not being sufficiently catered to. And if we have time in the discussion, I think there's some interesting stuff in the Malawi analysis that we can look back to on this point as well. So what you have here is a mixed picture, essentially. At the global level, you have improvement most rapidly in the regions that were doing least well, and to a certain extent the schools of characteristics that were doing less well. And you have some catching up story when it comes to individual students as well, but there are a few areas where it's being missed. So what actually seemed to be driving the improvement in learning? Well, this part of the analysis is early stage. We've done some OLS regression analysis. We're still kind of going into a bit more detail on this, but broadly speaking, that's the key things that we can pull out are that the improvements in teacher knowledge and teacher effort, which we observed at the global level, do make a big difference at the school level in terms of the improvement in learning outcomes. So this is a probability-based analysis. And a 10% in the school average teacher scores in the English knowledge assessment maps to a school being 5% more likely to have experienced an overall improvement in English schools. And similarly, we use the share of teachers who are assigning and collecting homework as a rough proxy for teacher effort overall, particularly because that's an activity where the effort required scales with the size of the class. And a 10% increase in teachers assigning and collecting homework leads to a 1% increase in the likelihood that the school will experience an improvement in math scores. So these are not, you know, the strongest kind of coefficients you've ever seen, but we do think that the improvements in terms of teacher effort, which we observed, and teacher knowledge and effort, which we observed, are making some difference to the improvement in learning. What we have a clearer sense, though, of is the remaining inequities that still exist in the 2016 data following this improvement. So Amber
Go ahead and give us the next slide. So this is a more sort of econometrically sophisticated analysis, but of a static set of data. We're not looking at the change between 2014 and 16. We're looking at what remains in the 2016 distribution of data. We have a hierarchical linear model with and without strata fixed effects. In the second column has the fixed effects, and the strata, like you showed you earlier, Dar es Salaam, urban, rural, IPUC T. And you can see here that schools with minimum infrastructure or a higher rate of infrastructure continue to outperform those that don't. And the same goes for minimum equipment and learning materials. Pupil-teacher ratio remains slightly negative, but probably not as strong as you might expect. Teaching experience remains slightly negative. So there's some sense, and this mirrors some findings from other countries, that actually the more long-standing teachers tend to reduce effort over time. And that sort of more than balances out their gains in terms of their knowledge. And again, mirroring the previous slide, the share of teachers that assign and collect homework is quite a strong correlate of learning. So there's a definite potential learning gain there from encouraging teachers to do that more. Teacher never hit a student. Actually, are we almost out of time, Emma?
I would say we're at time, so if you can wrap up on this slide, or
I think the only other thing I would point out is that and this sort of matches what we were saying, even though overage students and girls have caught up, you still have down the bottom there some significant underperformance of overage students and girls compared to the rest of the population. Go ahead, I think there's only one more slide. Yeah, so simple to sort of wrap up. Tanzania 2014-16, it's definitely an example of an improvement in the overall learning picture by raising the floor. The improvement was coming most rapidly from the weakest regions and from, by some measures, the weakest schools. It does seem like you can achieve significant improvements in learning, knowledge and effort, even in contexts where overall PCRs might be going down and where physical environments might not be improving altogether. But the next stage for Tanzania, I think, while continuing this work of trying to raise the low-performing schools is, and this mirrors the conclusions from the previous case study, of moving a little bit more in the direction of looking at the inequities between students, in particular between gender, overage and regular age students, and Kiswahili and non-Kiswahili speaking students. So this overlaps pretty nicely with some of the key takeaways, I think, from the first presentation. And that's it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to all of the speakers for doing a pretty great job of staying on time. We have about 15 minutes, and it's easiest to manage some of this by putting questions in the chat. We have about 28 participants online. So go ahead, Safaa. I can read questions from the chat. That's worked well in other sessions, or if you can read them yourself, you can manage those as well. Just let me know how you want to proceed.
So I actually, well, first wanted to thank all the presenters. I think this is great, not just sticking to time, but the issues that you've raised and the work that you've presented is really fantastic. I wanted to pass it over to Luis because I see he's back, and we had agreed that he will lead this part as a discussant slash moderator. So over to you, Luis.
Okay, thanks. I'll really minimize my discussant comments, and I'll literally try to do it in 1 minute. And just two observations. One is that I was in another panel that was similar to this, and one of the things that I think we're having trouble explaining to non-technical audiences is that the difference between what I call pure inequality in terms of like a Gini coefficient or something like that versus what I call attribute-related inequality. In other words, you could have a program conceivably that, let's say at baseline, the girls are doing better than the boys in reading. And at end line, the girls pulled out ahead even more than the boys. And so you have an increase in gender-related inequality. But it could be that because the program improves teaching, the inequality amongst the girls and the inequality amongst the boys improves more than the difference between them. And there you can have the apparently contradictory result that attribute-related inequality has increased, and it has, but overall inequality has been reduced. And I think we observe actually some of that a little bit in that last PowerPoint from Rav. So we're gonna have to work hard to explain this kind of stuff to non-technical audiences. The other interesting point, also derived from, in particular, the last presentation, I think to some extent also in Maitri and Jennifer's, is the whole interesting fact that in the world, there are now kind of two different interpretations of teaching at the right level. One is the kind of the Pratham oriented interpretation, where you group kids by ability level, take them out of the classroom, and provide them with supplementation, versus, I would say, the more common or conventional approach from people like Room to Read, I would say to some extent RTI, where you try to improve and target schools and help schools as a whole. But some of the data that Rob was showing about the variation within schools, not just the intra-student variation, but within schools being so large, you know, I think it'll be interesting to explore in the next year or two or three, especially as people like the World Bank gear up in some of these areas, you know, which of these two approaches to teaching at the right level make the most sense, and in which contexts, based on whether, again, based on these inequality considerations. So just to kick off any discussions and people raising their hands, I think in reality, Amber's going to be moderating. So I'll just be quiet on that.
Actually, can I
thanks, Louise.
start off using my my role as co-chair? And I think that the analysis is critical, because then the interventions can be more effective. And whether it's focusing on the girls or focusing on the more disadvantaged through income is important. One question I had when we look at the literacy, and we're measuring how many words kids are reading. What we're seeing is a lot of kids can actually read, but they don't really understand what they're reading. Are we getting at that with some of the work that you're doing, that really differentiating between measuring the number of words versus the ability to comprehend? And can we measure the extent of comprehension, right? Not just that they understand what they read, but to what extent they understood what they read. And so this is to the presenters, but also to you, Luis. One of the questions, and maybe we want to collect a few questions before responding. Thanks.
Okay, while presenters are answering that, please everyone feel free to type messages into the chat if you have questions.
If the presenters don't have answers to that, I can help out a little bit.
I just wanted to jump in and say that the presentation that Jennifer and I delivered today, we were focused completely on oral reading fluency, because this was kind of our exploratory analysis to introduce this idea. Safaa, you have a really good point that we did not talk about comprehension at all in our presentation. So we were focused on oral reading fluency for our analysis. With that said, I think it might be, the interpretation would be different, because the task of comprehension versus the task of a fluency rate of reading is different. So the interpretation would be completely different. But Luis, I'm interested to see what you have to say, that maybe we can adapt something like the Gini coefficient for a metric that we commonly do collect, such as reading comprehension based on a story that kids are reading. But the presentation that we gave today was focused on fluency.
Louis, before you come and just quickly jumping in on the evidence that Raf presented on Tanzania. So that's a good way of seeing like the two different data sets, one focusing on the oral reading fluency and the other focusing on the comprehension question. So if you look at like the disaggregated data, you have movement on both of them. So basically that kind of like reading fluency is sinking in terms of comprehension skills. But how much, to what extent is that going on, and which students benefit the most? It's an empirical question, and more needs to be investigated. Over to you.
Really quickly, the programs that have been run around the world typically are having quicker impact on fluency than on comprehension. Many of them do measure comprehension, enough to know that we're not having as much impact on that as we are on fluency in general. Number two, these measures could perhaps be used for comprehension in EGRA type or PAL ACER type tests. But that needs to be further explored, because a lot of these comprehension questions are kind of ordinal, not really ordinal, but they're not continuous variables in the way that fluency is, or in the way that a classical testing theory score in a test, namely percent correct, is. So I think A, we need to do more work on comprehension. B, the measurement of inequality and comprehension could probably be done with something like a Gini, but it needs more work.
I have a question for the presenters, speaking about Malawi and Tanzania, if that's all right. I was struck by—
Go ahead, Lauren.
Thanks. I was struck by the reminder of the importance of the student level characteristics and the differences within schools. And I was wondering, because you have been working on policy level and with ministries, what that conversation is like, and kind of the capabilities of these systems to really differentiate or support communities and schools to differentiate, to support like at that very micro student level.
I think I can quickly come on this, Lauren. It has been a challenging experience, and part of it is because of like the frame of reference, that what are the reference points that are available to the policymakers. So it's very difficult to start a conversation when you don't have like the right constructs and you don't have detailed kind of like evidence to start that conversation. But over time, when you develop these metrics, when you start telling them that the differences are arising from something different that they haven't noticed about. Like one of the key findings in terms of the teacher deployment issue is because of the measurement of like how to target like the right set of incentives. So if you get your targeting mechanism right, they understand that there is a need for the teachers to go to the needy schools, but there is no consensus on what constitutes a disadvantaged or needy school. And the data available to come up with that measure is highly problematic. And this goes in all dimensions, like whatever we are discussing, like Lois has mentioned a very important point on the gender dimension. Like how does the gender kind of like plays out in the classroom? Is it like the interaction between the overage girls and the girls factor? How much of that contributes in terms of the inequalities within the classroom? Likewise for the disabilities, likewise for the socioeconomic status. We are finding on top of socioeconomic status, if you control for the mindsets of the kids, you see a diverging picture that what they are bringing into the classroom might matter much more than controlling for the socioeconomic status. So I think we are kind of like hampered a little bit in terms of like on our measurement agenda, that whatever we make salient in terms of the collection of data becomes kind of like reference points on which we construct these stories.
I think I'll just add on that,
Thanks.
if I can briefly, Amber. I know we don't have a lot of time. I think know the whole framing of looking at inequity and distributions and levels of inequality is one which I think can be quite difficult to communicate to policymakers. It's very important work from an academic perspective, but ultimately, what policymakers want to see is a binary cutoff where you are or are not disadvantaged, are or are not as risk. And I think, relating to what Salman says, defining the cutoff of where you become kind of in need of some kind of special attention, be it remedial classes, be it whatever it might be, that's where a lot of the work goes in. You need to draw that line in the right place, but the methodology through which that line is drawn needs to be very straightforward and very reproducible. Otherwise, it tends to get diverged from over time. And you saw that with the teacher distribution work in Malawi, which Rachel mentioned earlier, where the definition was supposed to be based on rural urban, and it became very meaningless very quickly. So yeah, in my experience, if you talk to policymakers about inequality, they grasp the problem, but it's very hard to translate that into any kind of actual action measure.
I know we're at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, particularly in this rather turbulent time. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining today. There are additional questions there. I will work to ensure that the recording gets posted on the CIES virtual calendar. If you don't know yet, our virtual CIS is extending all the way through the end of April, so April 30th, and we're working hard to get as many presentations like this up and running, not just this week, but for the next month, as many of us work from very remote locations. So I would encourage you all to check the calendar daily, as it's always changing and more sessions are being posted. If you are a chair or a supporter or an organizer of another session later in the agenda, or that you didn't get a chance to schedule yet, you have until April 10th to get that either pre-recorded and you can post it so it's completely asynchronous, or do it like we did today, which was to host at a certain time and publicize the time. So thank you so much, everyone. It looks like Amy Jo and Lauren are posting their email addresses as well. I'm not sure if the other presenters would also like to post theirs to be able to distribute the presentation, so people can reach out to you if they would like a copy of the presentation. We did that previously in case individual people want to reach out and ask for the presentations. Okay. And thank you all for your patience with this, with the hiccups and working on a laptop and child interruptions and dog snoring next to me. It went reasonably well, I think. So I appreciate everybody's patience.
And we appreciate yours, Amber.
Thanks, Amber.
Thanks so much,
Forget Amber, it
Thank
looks
you.
like you're on a beautiful beach.
Thank you all. You all did a great job. A well-behaved set of presenters, so I appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amber.
Okay.
Great to e-meet all of you. Good luck. Stay safe.
everyone.
Same here.
Yes,
Thanks, Safaa.
be well, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, everyone.